How's it going, my rye bread enthusiasts? I hope you're having a great day so far. Welcome back to the channel. Today is episode number 4 of the rye bread series. We're making scones, so let's go to the kitchen and get started. Scones are kind of like a cake bread hybrid, not quite one or the other. The less butter we add to the dough, the more bready they become. Today I'll show you how to make two versions, one with butter and one without. Then you can make up your mind and choose what to make. On one hand, the buttery scones are so much lighter and more delicate, but on the other hand, the whole grain rye containing scones without butter are healthier. Of course, at the end of the day, it will depend on what you decide to top them with. I would personally go for the buttery scone anytime. I would top them with plenty of peanut butter and jam, but that's just because I don't eat these very often, or at all really. This is my first and probably the last time. I don't repeat most of the bakes seen on this channel, because there's just so much more to discover. But let's move on with these scones. Let me show you how they're made, starting with the ingredients. We'll need some whole grain rye flour, also known as dark rye flour. We'll need some white wheat flour, all-purpose or cake flour will do. It'll make the scones nice and light. We'll also need some salt, some baking powder or baking soda, an egg, buttermilk, honey, raisins. I'm going to use some anise seeds for flavoring. You could use fennel seeds instead, or even caraway seeds for a more savory tasting scone. And last but not least, we'll need an egg for glazing. These are the ingredients for the low-fat version. If you want to make buttery scones, then you will need some butter. Just make sure it's nice and cold before you use it. Moving on to the equipment, we'll need a tray with some non-stick paper, a pan for toasting the seeds, if you do decide to toast your seeds, a bowl, scales, a dough scraper, a brush, and a rolling pin. This recipe is super quick and easy, so the first step is to preheat the oven. 190 degrees Celsius, fan on. That'll be 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Right, get the seeds in the pan and toast them on high heat for around 2 minutes. Whilst the seeds are toasting, start mixing the dry ingredients. The white wheat flour, the whole grain rye flour, salt, baking powder, the raisins, and then once the toasted seeds are ready, add those too. Give it all a good mix, disperse the ingredients evenly. Once that's done, leave it on the side, grab a small bowl and start mixing the wet ingredients separately. That'll be the honey, the buttermilk and the egg. You'll notice that the honey will curdle the buttermilk, but don't worry about it, there's nothing wrong with that. Mix until all the ingredients are well combined, and then pour the wet ingredients over the dry ingredients. Then grab your dough scraper and mix it to a dough. Mix until there's no dry flour left. The dough will be very loose and sticky, but that's how it should be. Next, you want to place it down on a well-floured surface so it doesn't stick. Roll it around in the flour, dust it some more if need be, make sure you cover it on all sides. Flatten the dough and shape it using your hands and the rolling pin. Make it a rough square shape, about an inch or 2.5 centimeters thick. Then using your dough scraper, trim the edges and then cut the dough into 4 equal squares and then place them on a non-stick paper lined baking tray. Finally, collect the trimmings, press them together, flatten them and then trim to make another square. And after that you can collect the remaining trimmings and make one more square. This recipe makes 6 scones. 4 they'll be nice and square and 2 a little bit rough around the edges. If you're going to multiply the recipe, you should end up with fewer scones made from trimmings and more perfectly square ones. While I finish prepping the scones, I want to address the leavening. I'm using baking powder, first because that's what I had at home already, but secondly it's double acting. So you'll start producing gas before the scone goes in the oven, but it will also react a second time once it gets up to temperature. You can use baking soda if you want. I have converted it in a recipe for you already. Right, let's get these bad boys in the oven. They'll take around 15 minutes to fully bake. Because they're not very tall, I'm baking them in the middle shelf of the oven, in order for them to be closer to the heating element. And there you go, that's how you make a bready scone. We'll leave these on the rack to cool down and move on to the buttery version. The method is extremely similar. The only difference is that we must mix the butter into the dry ingredients. So once you have your flours, the salt, the baking powder, the raisins and the seeds mixed up, add the cold butter chunks and crumble them into the mix. This will take a minute, just make sure the mix is nice and even. Once it starts resembling wet sand, it's ready. Now mix the wet ingredients, the honey, the egg and the buttermilk and pour them over the dry ingredients. Then grab your dough scraper and mix until there's no dry flour left. You'll notice that this time the dough is a lot stickier and looser than previously. That is the effect of the butter loosening everything up. You can use even more flour for dusting this time. Tip the dough out on the table, collect it together, roll it around in the flour so it's covered on all sides. The process of making these scones is exactly the same as previously. Flatten the dough, roll it out slightly, make sure it's nice and thick, trim off the edges, cut into 4, collect the trimmings and make some more. Place them on a non-stick paper lined tray, glaze with egg, and then pop them in the oven. If you don't want to use egg in the dough, replace it with 30 more grams or 1 ounce of buttermilk and 10 grams or 0.3 ounces of fat. And of course use a different kind of glaze. You could even glaze them with buttermilk. Right, let's get these things in the oven. They will of course take the same amount of time to bake as the previous ones. As you can already see, they have puffed up a lot more. It's a great indicator for lightness. And that is how you make buttery rice scones. Let's leave them to cool down so we can have a closer look and compare them. First, let's have a look at the bready scone. Don't get me wrong, it's still very soft and nice, especially if you eat it right after baking. It's quite bouncy and quite light. But if you want ultimate softness, then the buttery version is what you're after. You can just see it in the crumb before I even squeezed it. It just looks so much more like a cake. It really is extremely light and delicate. But you can make up your own mind, or try both. So what do you think this recipe, and which one do you prefer, the low fat or the buttery one? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.